Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast exploring sex, relationships, and liberation. I'm your host, Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming inside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
On today's episode, we have Ifetayo. Join us for a conversation all about the psychedelic transformation of trauma. Together, we talk about building expansive communities, bravely imagining a new future, and the transformative power of vulnerability. Hello, dear listener, and welcome back to Modern Anarchy. I am so delighted to have all of you pleasure activists from around the world tuning in for another episode each Wednesday. My name is Nicole. I am a sex and relationship psychotherapist with training in psychedelic integration therapy. And I am also the founder of the Pleasure Practice, supporting individuals in crafting expansive sex lives and intimate relationships. Dear listener, hello, hi. I am so honored to be bringing you this conversation today. Today's guest was very vulnerable with her story, and so many of these episodes on the podcast, I'm just honored that each guest continues to trust me to open up, to be vulnerable about the difficult experiences that they have gone through and how they have transformed them in their story into moments of empowerment. And I'm honored when we laugh on this show. I'm honored when we cry on this show together. And I'm so happy to have you here, dear listener, joining me for the journey each week of the unfolding of the show and the guests that trust me. And we're making something very, very special. And today's guest had said, we have to have the imagination and the courage to say there has to be something better. And this just reminded me of, the anarchists saying that another world is possible. And that is absolutely the case, dear listener. I hope that you are inspired to keep dreaming, to be brave and bold and bright in that vision that you see for your world, your community, your lovers. Hold on to that and have the courage to demand change as all of these wild things are happening. Hold on to that vision, hold on to that love, that space, the vulnerability that we can create when we are really present with each other. And I'm so, so grateful that you are present with me now, present with me each Wednesday. And I'm so excited to keep learning and unlearning and learning and growing with you in this space, dear listener. All right. If you are ready to liberate your pleasure, you can explore my offerings and resources at modernanarchypodcast.com, linked in the show notes below. And I want to say the biggest thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. You are supporting the long-term sustainability of the podcast, keeping this content free and accessible to all people. So thank you. If you want to join the Patreon community, get exclusive access into my personal exploration and research, then you can head on over to patreon.com/modernanarchypodcast, also linked in the show notes below. And with that, dear listener, please know that I am sending you all my love. And let's tune in to today's episode. Well, then we'll dive in. And the first question I ask every guest is, how would you like to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Thank you. I would introduce myself as Ifetayo Harvey. I'm originally from Charleston, South Carolina. Been living in New York for about 8 years, and I am the executive director of the People of Color Psychedelic Collective.
Great. It's a joy to have you here, and I'm excited to talk to you today. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Hmm. So tell me, why are you passionate about the work that you do?
I'm passionate about the work that I do because we're in a really interesting moment in the world and also in the psychedelic field specifically. And there are a lot of people who want to learn about psychedelics or want to try psychedelics and they don't know where to start. And for me, as someone who benefited from psychedelic use, I know what it's like to be in the space and not see people who look like you and to seek that out. And so I like to see myself as a resource for people, to support people, to give people education, to help people find and build community.
Hmm. Yeah. And I know you're talking a little bit about your personal journey with that. I'd love to hear more if you'd be willing to share about what your journey has been and to, yeah, find those spaces where you weren't seen in that way and what that journey has looked like for you.
Yeah. So I would say this journey started at a really early age for me. When I was 4, my dad went to prison for selling drugs. He was
Mm,
convicted of cocaine trafficking and sentenced to 15 years in prison in Florida. I grew up in South Carolina, so there was some distance. And as a kid, I didn't really understand what it meant to be in prison, right? A lot of times our kids' understanding of prisons or jails or from media, from TV, movies, books. And so in my mind, I associate my dad with being a bad guy or, associating with those bad guys who belong in jail or belong
mm,
in prison. And I think I internalized a lot of my experiences being a child of someone who was in prison. And I had a lot of stigma and a lot of shame
mm.
that kept me from talking about it. And, I didn't know how to talk about it.
Right.
A lot of times when someone goes to prison in your family, it's like kept on the hush hush because of that shame. You don't want people asking too many questions. You don't want people judging you. And so I went through life not really talking about the fact that my dad was incarcerated. When I was 12, my dad was released early after serving about 8 years, and he was deported to Jamaica. This is in 2004. So he's been in Jamaica since 2004. And when he was released, obviously that gave us more room and more space to actually, I guess, reunite. While my dad was in prison, we would write letters back and forth to each other,
Mm,
and never talk on the phone, or I never visited him while he was incarcerated. And so his release gave me an opportunity to, get to know him as a person, and through knowing him, I've come to understand myself more. And so when I was 16, I got my first job, saved up money to get my own passport and buy a ticket to Jamaica to see him. And so that was kind of the start of us rebuilding our relationship. And when I went to college, I started opening up to friends and classmates about my dad. I had a few friends in college who also had parents who went to prison or were in and out of jail. And so I started to see how by me sharing my story, other people felt like they were given permission to also share their story. And during my junior year at Smith, I started an internship at the Drug Policy Alliance. They were one of the first organizations that I came across that talked about people who use drugs or were drug involved in a compassionate, non-stigmatizing way. And so I saw this as an opportunity for me to join this movement that I wasn't really familiar with. And at the Drug Policy Alliance, I wrote a few op-eds, blogs. One of them was titled "Children of Incarcerated Parents Bear the
mm,
Weight of the War on Drugs." And I was talking about how 1 in 9 Black children will have a parent in prison, how a lot of people who have parents or family members in prison are experiencing mental health issues or struggling in silence. And the Drug Policy Alliance a few months later invited me to be one of their opening plenary speakers at their conference,
Yeah.
the International Drug Policy Reform Conference in Denver. This is in 2013. And I had a really cathartic moment where I was giving my talk, and I'm a person who's very comfortable doing public speaking. I was a student council kid growing up.
Mm-hmm.
But during this talk, I just broke down crying in front of
Yeah.
1,100 people. And in some ways, I felt embarrassed, but so
Mm.
many people afterwards affirmed me and affirmed my story and said that they could relate.
Mm.
And afterwards, I'm going to different panels, different talks. And mind you, I'm still in college. By this time, I'm a senior in college. And I just got diagnosed with major depressive disorder. And so that was kind of hitting me hard,
Mm.
even though I knew that I had depression tendencies since I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that that was connected to my father's incarceration. But to hear it from a psychiatrist or your therapist, it just made it more real for me. And so while I was giving this speech, I was in the middle of like a depressive episode, and I had so many responsibilities. I was taking on a lot of leadership positions at my college, and I ended up going to a panel on end of life treatment and psychedelics. And this is my first time ever hearing about psychedelics used in a therapeutic setting. My mom used psychedelics when she was in her 20s, and I was really into the music from that era, the 60s and 70s. And
Sure.
at that time, my friends were all trying like Molly, which is like, I guess, the street form of MDMA. And so, being at this panel, they were talking about how people who have terminal illnesses, like cancer, have a great deal of existential anxiety.
Yeah.
And that resonated with me because as a kid, I had existential anxiety. I would ask my mom, like, oh, what's the point of life? Why are we here? Why are
Mm-hmm.
we living? And that convinced me to try mushrooms because I was in this depressive episode. I was struggling with suicidal ideation. Therapy was helping, but it didn't feel like it was moving fast enough. And I was scared to try pharmaceutical meds.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so psychedelics seemed like a alternative. I knew that my friends at school knew about mushrooms. So after the conference was over, I went back to school and I was like asking my friends, like, how do I do mushrooms? Like, how
Yeah.
does it work? Um, and they're like, okay, well, you should take 3.5 grams. You should go into nature. By the way, it's really nasty. So like you should eat it in something. It sounds like, okay, like, taking notes. And
Yeah.
but I was just really desperate. I was really desperate because I hadn't been
Mm.
this depressed in a really long time. And I wanted to, like,
Yeah.
snap myself out of it because I was so scared that I was going to fuck up my responsibilities that I had taken on.
Right.
And so one Saturday morning, I fixed my mushroom peanut butter sandwich, and
Yeah.
I had one of my friends be my sitter. She was a psych major, and I
Nice.
trusted her with my life. She's a therapist now. And
Great.
so we went out into this nature trail on my college campus, and the mushrooms started kicking in. I started seeing like the trees glistening or the
Mhm.
water glistening and the plants breathing. And I was like, whoa, this is, I started to get a little overwhelmed. And, mushrooms also can induce nausea in a lot of folks. And so I was feeling that. And
Sure.
it felt like I was just like I had drank too much and I was about to vomit.
Oh
And I hate
no.
that feeling. So
Yeah.
that was my first psychedelic journey. And it ended up being, 6 to 8 hours. And I was just processing a lot of things. I went into the journey with a lot of expectations, and it kind of just went against all of my expectations and showed me something completely different. And I was able to laugh. I was able to cry. I was um
Mhm.
I was able to feel in a way that I hadn't felt in a long time. And to me, that was the most important thing, was just being able to laugh, being able to cry, and also see the beauty of life, see the beauty of the people around me, but also see the beauty of like nature, and knowing that it's living and breathing and communicating with you,
Mm.
whether you see it or not. And so that really changed my trajectory, because I had no interest in psychedelics. I had no interest in working in the psychedelic field. In my mind, I was going to, be a social worker, therapist, or be a teacher for middle
Mm.
school or high school students. I ended up getting a job at the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. This is about a year after I graduated in 2015. And I was working as the assistant to Rick Doblin, the founder, and it was a really interesting 8 months that I spent at MAPS. I won't say it was bad, because it wasn't, but I learned a lot. I learned a lot about the big players in the psychedelic field, but I also learned that the psychedelic field has a lot of issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the time, I was the only Black person at MAPS. Um,
Yeah.
and that was uncomfortable for a lot of reasons. And I know that MAPS has changed a lot since 2015. They've grown, but back then, it was a different organization, and it was clear that race wasn't being considered as a factor, when we talk about PTSD and healing trauma with psychedelics. So having that experience led to creating this organization, the People of Color Psychedelic Collective, because I found myself looking for people who were talking about how these substances can help heal many traumas, whether that be sexual trauma, racial trauma. Um, there wasn't many people having those conversations. I remember I went to a panel at the Alchemist Kitchen in 2016 in New York, and it was on psychedelics and race, and I was super excited.
Mm.
And I just left feeling so disappointed,
Mm.
because it was a panel of mostly people of color, and it just felt like everyone was too afraid to really talk about race directly. There was one white guy on the panel, and it felt like the white guy was the only one who was comfortable being explicit about race and racism. And so that led me to write a piece for Symposia called Why the Psychedelic Community is So White. And then I started just receiving emails from people saying like, "Hey, I read your piece. Like, I want to like work with you. I want to connect." And so we had a call in November 2017, about 20, 30 people. It was a mixed group,
Mm.
just talking about race and psychedelics and our experiences with it. And after that call, I took the reins of that group and started
Yeah.
facilitating more and more. And then that evolved into us doing projects and becoming a nonprofit. And, that led, where we are today. But psychedelics have been a tool in my healing journey, and I'm grateful for the experiences. And it's something that, I would say, is a slow process, right? When we are really down on our luck or down bad, we want something to fix us really quickly.
Right.
And and that's because we don't want to feel the suffering. And in some ways, I did have that a quick change in me, but at the same time, it's been a journey, and healing is a lifelong journey. We're never going to be fully healed in this lifetime, but we can strive to, reach our potential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for trusting me and sharing that with me and all of the listeners. I really appreciate that vulnerability. And before we get into it, I just want to hold space, when we look back on the journey of where you've gone, from the beginning, like starting at that 4 years old self, right? And the experiences with your dad. I mean, what a journey to get to hear. So I'm curious, as you just shared your story, like, how does it feel in this present moment to kind of like look back and just see the journey you've gone through?
Mm. Yeah, in some ways, it feels surreal.
Mm.
Um, it feels sometimes I have to like remind myself like this is really my life. You
Yeah.
know, this isn't just some story that I'm making up, or, you know, I really like sometimes I have to remind myself like that, like, yeah, my dad really did go to prison. That was really his life. And thinking about how that affected my family. So I think it feels surreal for me, but I think I have to accept that part of my power is being able to take something so ugly and make it into something beautiful, right? So
Mhm.
taking that experience with my dad and that separation and that trauma and making it into something beautiful. When I first started speaking about my story, I saw that like even folks older than me were like, "Whoa, like this is kind of scary for you to like share your vulnerability in this
Mm.
way." And I saw that they were scared of their own vulnerability. Yeah, and I would go to different programs. Like I spoke at a camp for children of incarcerated parents in Cape Cod. I spoke at an after school program here in New York for children of incarcerated parents. And I just saw how easy it is to be a positive role model for these kids and to
Mhm.
speak to them and how they relate to me as an adult, telling them that, hey, I went through the same thing you're going through now.
Yeah.
So I think it's really about accepting reality, right? Not getting stuck in the what ifs. Like, oh, well, what if my dad didn't go to prison? How would
Mm.
my life be then? Or, you know, what if I didn't do psychedelics or whatever? And really, yeah, just accepting my life for what it is and accepting my ability to take something so ugly and turn it into something positive.
Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. So it makes sense to feel that surrealness of it, but to ground yourself in all of the beauty and the ways that you can speak to those kids from lived experience that other people can't, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 And it's really that simple. It's really that simple. Just talking to, you know, the youth like they're people. A lot of times I hear people complaining about teenagers, you know, being teenagers. And I, I, I think like we were all once there, right? What did we need back then? Who did we need? And I try to be that person.
Hmm. Yeah. And I'm curious when look back to your younger self along that journey, is there anything that you would want to say to her as she was in the midst of like processing all of this?
Mm. I think what comes to mind is that I think that meme of Chris Jenner, or not Chris Jenner. No, it is Chris Jenner. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Of she's like, "You're doing amazing, sweetie."
Yeah.
um I I think I would tell her that because so many of us have like we doubt ourselves because of, you know, the systems that we live under. We doubt our intelligence, we doubt our abilities. And I look back at some of the things I was doing as a teenager and I'm so impressed with myself. I'm
Mm,
like, wow, I really
yeah.
wrote that. Like, that's really cool, you know? And I think I would also tell her that, like, you have a community of people who support you and believe in you. So, you know, don't be afraid to try something or experiment with something new.
Yeah, such good words of advice for the past, the present, and the future self to listen back to, right? Of like, we got this, we're doing the best we can, and it's great, right?
Mhm,
Yeah,
mhm,
so
mhm,
powerful. And I'm glad that you had such a beautiful first experience, right? Um,
mhm.
it reminds me of like people's first experiences having sex, right? And how that sort of like shapes the unfolding of your journey, right? Depending on how that looks, And so for you to have this first experience of the profoundness with someone who was sitting for you to be out in nature, to have that beauty and to feel, right? Sometimes thinking about psychedelics as that non-specific amplifier, it sometimes for me is like
Mhm,
that wringing out of the sponge, to be able to like really like
mhm,
cry and squeeze
mhm.
that out, which is often, depending on how we're moving through the world, we have to be really stiff to function
Yep.
and survive, right? So to have
Mhm,
that moment of that wringing out to cry and laugh and giggle, I mean, what a
Mhm.
profound space to have had your first experience in.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I'm super grateful. I'm super grateful for that to be my first experience, because I know for a lot of people, their first experiences can be traumatizing, right?
Yeah.
And
Sorry, I shouldn't laugh,
and
I guess. But yes.
yeah, and I a lot of times when I tell that story, people are like, "You took 3.5 grams your first time? That's a lot."
That is a
I'm
lot.
like, "Oh, I didn't realize." And so I'm even more grateful in hindsight that something didn't go wrong, because so many things could have gone wrong,
Mhm.
and what you said about that stiffness that we all carry ourselves with is so real. We live in a society that doesn't value emotional intelligence or just spiritual, somatic intelligence, all that stuff. We value very specific kinds of intelligences, right? And I'm just, I guess, reminded of how so many of us are holding so much pain or trauma or whatever, because we don't have the space to really unravel, right? That space to, like you said, the sponge to like be squeezed and have it all just come out. And so that's something I'm thinking about, like how do we change our society from being what it is to being more of a human centered society, or a care centered society, where people can be cared for and also care. Because I think, earlier I said we were in an interesting moment in the world. And I say that because I think a lot of people are seeing like society crumble in front of our eyes. And so there's that grief, you know, collective grief.
Yep.
And in some ways it feels like we all know what's going on, but we're not really talking about it, or processing it, right? We had a whole, I don't want to say, I don't want to speak in the past tense, but the COVID-19 pandemic really, we still haven't processed all those people from who died in 2020, before the vaccines, before we had rapid tests and all that stuff, and all the new information we're learning. We still haven't processed all that grief. Like, we went through this big collective trauma, and I think that we're starting to see like the after effects of it, right? I'm hearing people say like, "Oh, are people meaner nowadays, or is it just me?" And I think we're all kind of noticing, like, we're all on edge. We're
Yeah.
all on edge, but we don't know what to do. We do know, but we're afraid to really take that step.
Right. Yeah, because you got to get to work on Monday. Pull yourself together, figure it out, show up, right? Like, just under
Mhm.
capitalism, like these efficient modes of production. Grief is not an efficient mode of production for the system. So, no,
Nope.
we don't have space for that. And if you come into a therapist office with someone like me, I mean, I wouldn't do this, but just like within the field, right?
Mhm.
Prolonged grief disorder. Let me actually
Yep.
pathologize
Yeah.
ooh,
Mhm.
your pain. Fuck.
Mhm.
And then just yeah, even thinking about the pandemic, right? How many of us had this space to be able to work from home or have more of that, but how many people didn't ever
Yep.
get a break during that, depending on identity
Mhm.
factors and all of that, right? Like many people never even got that break even to process that stuff that was going on. They had to show
Mhm.
up every day at the grocery store. They had to show up every day
Yep.
at the hospital, right? And so many of us haven't even had any time to even sit at home, or like I had the privilege of being at home at working, right? I mean, there's just so
Mhm.
much to
Mhm.
that yes, to have that psychedelic experience that really cracks that open. When thinking about the psilocybin experience, 8 hours, when the fuck do I have 8 hours to just sit? My only days off are Saturday, Sunday, and I got to do the
Right.
errands, right? Like, when do I just
Mhm.
have 8 hours? Like, I mean, that's part of the whole thing.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. The
Yep.
privilege to be able to have a day off, and that's something I try to mention anytime I do like a public speaking event, that we're privileged to be able to go to these retreats, or go to a clinic and get ketamine or whatever, or go and do what they call like an underground service.
Right.
Like we're very privileged to be able to do this. Like we live in a country that still does not have paid leave or sick leave for everyone. And so that's something I just try to really emphasize in a lot of the spaces I'm in, because there's so many psychedelic enthusiasts who are like, oh, well, if everyone just took more psychedelics, the world would be a better place. Or, psychedelics being integrated into our mental health system will help so many people. And it's like, yeah, but our mental health system is already like bursting at the seams, right? Our medical system is is also bursting at this. Like we don't see how we don't have the proper infrastructure that's needed to for psychedelics to have a positive impact. Like we don't have universal health care.
No.
People are traumatized by the health care they receive, or it's too expensive,
Yep.
or they're dealing with medical racism. And so that deters people from trusting medical professionals. And I also talk about how medical professionals have a history of, kind of acting like cops.
Yes. No,
So
not kind of. Yes.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
they are the additional arms of, criminalization. And so we have to really, I guess, have the imagination and also have the courage to say, like, y'all, there is something better than this bullshit that we're in. Like
Hmm.
the systems that we're living under have become so convoluted and bureaucratic that by the time people do organize themselves to change a law or to change, some policy, we have a million other issues that have
Oh yeah.
cropped up, right? So
Yeah.
I
Yes.
always say that bureaucracy is going to kill us all because we've become so disempowered from each other, from our communities, that we don't know how to go about making a change.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, yeah, let alone the financial pieces, all of the mess of
Hmm.
that, and even just being in school or these systems like you were at with MAPS, right? And the lack of diversity of people in those
Hmm.
spaces. I mean, even if we get it through to the system and functioning under the system is problematic in and of itself, right? So like we
Hmm.
have to,
Hmm.
like you said, like dream of this whole upheaval of a whole different world of possibilities of healing that are even outside of the containers of the field of psychology that come from
Hmm.
white men 100 years
Hmm.
ago, right? Like
Hmm.
if we don't see
Hmm.
the problem in that lineage, I'm terrified,
Hmm.
right? Like there's a
Hmm.
lot of
Hmm.
problems in that lineage, and so to be able to see beyond that is does require dreaming.
Hmm. Hmm. And capitalism, because it only values certain types of intelligence, a lot of people have limited
Yes.
imagination. And so when you say something like, oh, well, why don't we just take over these vacant houses and renovate them and say fuck the government and just do it anyway, right? Like they're like, well, that'll be breaking the law. Like we might go to jail, And it's like, okay, yeah, that's the point. That's the point. That's the point. But that's why it's so important to have people who have that lived experience, because a lot of folks in the psychedelic field, they don't like to talk about mass incarceration, even though there are people who've gone to jail for psychedelics. Um,
Yep.
but knowing someone who goes to prison, in some ways, I think it brings you closer to that reality,
Hmm.
and also makes you less afraid, because you already know the worst of the worst that that they're capable of, and or I should say the powers that be or the systems are capable of.
Right.
And so I think in some ways my father's incarceration made me less fearful
Mm.
of the powers that be.
Right. To look it in the face and know what could happen.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was also just thinking about how your podcast is called Modern Anarchy, and how, at the beginning of the pandemic, people started talking about mutual aid and doing
Right.
mutual aid. I was doing some mutual aid, like grocery shopping for people with disabilities or immunocompromised people. And to me, that 2020 was an opportunity for us as a collective to really shift the way we see life and shift the way we see capitalism. I think for, the white collar class who was working from home, a lot of us began seeing how, like, I don't want to say, I hope I don't offend anyone, but how non-essential a lot of our jobs are.
Yeah. Yes.
and and doing mutual aid, I was just thinking, why don't we do this all the time? Why aren't we doing this all the time? Why aren't we checking on our older neighbors and saying, like, hey, do you need anything? Why aren't we organizing resources in our community to give to one another? And then, when a lot of the uprisings start to happen in that summer, again, it was an opportunity to kind of shift the way we see policing, right? People started saying defund the police, and some folks are saying, like, oh no, that phrase is too alienating, blah 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 blah. And we get stuck on conversations like that. But if you look at the evidence, at how much money we're giving police departments, and they're buying military grade weapons
Yeah.
and equipment. Meanwhile, our schools are crumbling. We don't have community spaces where people can just hang out and just be. In New York City, our mayor has decided it's more important to fund law enforcement than it is to keep libraries open. So in some ways, it feels like we missed a lot of opportunity to really change our society for the better. And in some ways, COVID felt like the first time for a lot of people where we felt cared for, where we felt that community that we are lacking now.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, these are just things that I'm I guess thinking about on the day to day. Like,
Yeah.
how do we hold space for the grief? How do we use psychedelics carefully and consciously to help people? But also, what kind of models, what kind of healing models or organizing models are easily replicated and can be used in many different places in order to make a change?
Mm-hmm. So essential, right?
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of the rat park research, which,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
just cluing it in for the research for the listeners again, if they're not familiar, this model of looking at drug use where the researchers had put the rats in the cage with heroin and cocaine
Mm-hmm.
water, and they drank it to excess where they actually killed themselves through
Mm-hmm.
so much drug use, right? Compared to the paradigm of later researchers coming in and saying, well, what if we actually gave a beautiful park for the rats to enjoy with things to do and other rats, and how in that paradigm they used very little of the drug and thrived, right? And I think so much of these
Mm-hmm.
systems of violence and things that we're seeing, right? Like, what the fuck is the cage that we're in? And like, how
Mm-hmm.
do we focus on that and funding the libraries, right? Rather than
Mm-hmm.
like this restricted paradigm of seeing the violence and focusing on it. We have to think about the whole cage that we're in the system.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's so beautiful to be thinking about this, and so necessary in terms of the work, because the reality is psychedelics are not going to change the world, right? We see it's about the community. Yeah, I know you're like, no, we see people who do psychedelics, and it's a reflection then of their community, of when you do psychedelics and then say, whoa, let's capitalize the hell out of this, charge people an exorbitant amount of money and make so much money off of this. Yay, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
exactly, right? Versus oh wow, this is a really beautiful, healing potential that comes from nature. How do we give back to our communities? How do we function in mutual aid? How do we change the system so that we stop capitalizing off of people's health and existence to live in this world? Like, those are radically different spaces, both funded
Mm-hmm.
by the psychedelic experience that makes you feel really passionate about
Mm-hmm.
that thought that's going through your head, but radically shifted by who's in your community and who's in your circle, right? So like, psychedelics
Mm-hmm.
aren't going to change the world. It's a question of who are you doing it with, and who are the
Right.
examples, the leaders in your spaces that are bringing up these questions of mutual aid.
Right. 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 Yeah. And I love that you kind of painted the separate camps, right? because a lot of time it's just so funny to me how people in the psychedelic field can have these really powerful experiences. They'll talk about the DMT elves, but they cannot imagine a world without prisons or police. So, okay, you can do these mind bending drugs and see all this cool shit, but you can't imagine a world without police, even though that world has existed before. You
Right.
can't, you can't imagine. So, it's really interesting seeing what people take from their journeys. And to me, if your journeys aren't helping you show up in community better, then maybe you need to try something else. Because yeah,
Mhm.
there's this assumption that psychedelics make you a better person or they have these pro-social qualities to them. And I don't think that's true. I think a lot of times, it depends on facilitation, depends on your setting, who you're with, but it also is a lot of times it just amplifies what's already there. And we can't we can't depend on that to make the world better. And it's just ridiculous. Like we don't say that about any other class of drugs. We don't say like, oh, if everyone was on opioids, the world would be a better place. Like no, it's really simple. If we made the world a better place, more enjoyable, then the world will be a better place. Like that's
Mhm.
and how do we do that? Like people need to have their needs met. Everyone deserves food, clothing, shelter.
Right.
It's crazy that like me saying that will will bring reactions or people will say like, oh well, no, that's their responsibility. Blah blah blah. It's like no, we're all connected, right? Individualism is a big part of why I think so many people struggle with this because we don't see ourselves as responsible to each other, and we definitely don't see ourselves as responsible to the earth.
Mhm.
I think we see ourselves as separate.
Yeah.
So yeah, and the other thing is that you're what you were talking about with the rat park experiment. Again, it's like common sense. Like yeah, if
Yeah,
people
I
have
know.
a pretty place and they hang out with their friends and their family and their community and have all their needs met, yeah, they're not gonna need to escape using substances that much anymore.
Mhm.
So a lot of this stuff is really simple, but we make it seem like it's this convoluted thing. And I was grateful when I first entered the drug policy reform world. One of my assignments as an intern was to read Carl Hart's book, Dr.
Mm,
Carl Hart, High Price. And
mm,
he really does a good job of breaking down addiction. And he says that most people who use drugs aren't actually addicted. Some people might have dependency, some people might have problematic use, but it's not always addiction. And I think a lot of times we overstate how much addiction is in this country, but people can also break through their addictions when we get at the root of what is causing them pain.
right. Which is the cage, right? The
Mhm.
cage and
Mhm.
then our interpersonal relationships, depending which are shaped by the cage, right? Our lineages of
Mhm.
trauma and how that impacts us growing up. So thinking about that as more of the source to be attacking, right? And
Mhm.
it's just it is so hard for people to view a world without police. It is so hard for people to view a world without capitalism, right? Like these
Mhm.
alternative, revolutions of what it could look like. I think that's an important part of the activism is to actually
Mhm.
step into that dreaming space because it is so hard. Like how would we function? What would the day to day, who's going to
Mhm.
be the janitor, right? Like all of these like the jobs
Yeah.
that you think no one wants to do,
Mhm.
right? That's where
Mhm.
I remember
Mhm.
I listened to like Upstream and they do a lot of
Mhm.
conversations around capitalism and like what it would look like to get
Mhm.
out of the structure, which has helped me even to think about like, okay, how would this look? But so many of us don't even have that paradigm, so it seems so impossible, right? And so we stay in the
Mhm.
limited. It's
Mhm.
hard. It was heartbreaking to me with my family's Mormon, so
Oh wow.
there's deep connections between religious ideology and political perspectives, and so it's sometimes fun for me to like,
Mhm.
given where I'm at, like drop my ideas over there and just see how they land, you know. Um, And my sister has a little baby and she's had a lot of health problems. She was a
Mhm.
preemie, complicated things. And so my sister's, just like surviving. And she had to go to the ER and take the baby and just had
Mhm.
these radical bills. And she's like, it's so
Mhm.
crazy. Like these bills
Mhm.
that I'm being charged to keep my baby alive. And I'm like, yeah, that's wild. Like, next time I know when there's a president that's going to offer universal health care, I know who you'll be voting for. And she goes, I don't know. I mean, I think I just need to get this better job over here. I hear that this better job, I know. I hear this better job has better copays and I'll be okay. And I'm like, damn it, like
Yep.
she's talking about the pain point, but not seeing that additional world of we could get beyond this damn privatization of healthcare, of profiting off of you, dear sister. Like we could get out
Mhm.
of that, right? And I think so many
Mhm.
people are in that of like, well, no, no, no. Like this, the step over here is just this better job with the pay. And I'm like, oh,
Right. Right. Yep.
oh,
Yep. Yeah, a lot of yeah, it's that individual thinking. We're like, I just need a better job. I just need to do better. And it's like, no, we have the resources available for everyone to be better. We just don't want everyone on the same level because capitalism relies on the exploitation of poor people to
yes,
function.
yes.
And poverty is a social construct, is something that's created and maintained through these systems. So it's always funny when you get people almost to the point and they're like, no,
I
no.
know.
And that's, in some ways, to me, it's like it's a survival mechanism, right? It's like, okay, well, I just need to be better. I just need to be better.
Well, totally. That's what I think about like Stockholm syndrome, right? Where you've been abused
Mhm.
so much so that you're just like, no, like this is okay. Like this like
Mhm.
less abuse
Mhm.
over here is totally cool. And I'm like, no, dear sister, like beyond, beyond. Let's get out of the
Mhm.
abusive structures, right? But it's so
Mhm.
normalized,
Mhm.
even just thinking about having a 5 day week for work. People literally died to have us have work for only 5 days,
Right.
friends, right? Like, I
Mhm.
think some of us
Mhm.
forget that structure and how much that impacts us. And just
Mhm.
dreaming beyond that world. I mean, the people at the top are like just fucking having a ball up there of all of us on the bottom here struggling, right?
Right.
And then all of us
Right.
somewhere in the middle go, well, I worked really fucking hard for my money. I'm not going to share that through
Mhm.
mutual aid. I worked hard.
Mhm.
They should work hard, right? And again, not seeing like
Mhm.
the large structure of, whoa, there's people at the top, and if we restructured, this would be a
Mhm.
whole different
Mhm.
game, my friend.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. It's like, especially in the US, we don't realize how much propaganda we're fed.
Yeah.
Like it's just so much propaganda that we mentally have to work through in order not to like tear ourselves apart, because again, a lot of times we internalize, like you said, the people at the tops fuckery. We internalize it and make it like, oh well, it reminds me of that song from Fiddler on the Roof, If I
Mm,
Was a Rich Man. And Tevye is just like, well, if I had a rich man, I'd do this, I'd do that, blah, blah, blah. And I think we all kind of think like that. Well, when I get rich or when I
right.
make it past this income bracket, then I'll be set. I don't have to worry about anything. So we treat money or climbing, the corporate job ladder as our escape
Yep.
from capitalism, or that's the solution, when it's like, well, what about everyone else? Like me, I grew up in a family of 7 kids. My mom was a single parent, so we were very working class, poor, and I went to a very prestigious college and done a lot of things, but what does all those things mean if I can't take my family with me? If they don't have access to the same opportunities and space to be a person? It sometimes I have to like remind myself, because or just remind myself of where I came from. Like this is let me
Yeah.
okay. So before the pandemic, I'd be working in the office and I would like call my mom just to like tell her
Mm.
something really quickly. And she's like, I don't want you to get in trouble for talking on the phone at work.
Oh.
Or like are you sure you're not taking too long of a break? And that was
Yeah.
because my family's working class and we work blue
Yep.
collar jobs, and
Yep.
people don't understand that service workers are not afforded a lot of protections that white collar workers are given. You know, like I grew up working in fast food. My older sister was a bartender for 20 years. A lot of those people can't even sit down.
Nope.
A lot of the folks don't even actually get a lunch break, even though legally they're supposed to get a lunch break.
Right.
And so we don't realize, just, I don't even know where I was going with that, but
I hear you.
just how much privilege we have. But at the same time, why aren't we saying like everyone should have this privilege that I have? Everyone should have access to education and rest and hobbies or whatever. A lot of times we say, well, they didn't work hard enough.
Yeah.
Like it's easier to say that than to actually question the system that
Right.
we're in.
Yeah. As if the systems are fair. Right? They should
Mhm.
work
Mhm.
harder. Oh, it's a
Mhm.
perfectly fair system. Totally, right?
Mhm.
The
Mhm. Yeah.
absurdity.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm really curious to see how psychedelic decriminalization or legalization or medicalization plays out, because I think it's going to be just a new product or a new medication or the new Prozac, right? And we focus on, again, treating the symptoms, but not actually treating the root of the issue, both on a collective and individual level.
Which is absurd. Like, God, if I can do anything
Mhm.
with the rest of my career of psychology, right, it will be like that conversation of how do we work more upstream to prevent these systems or symptoms, right? It's just, it's absurd to me, any level of mental health perspective that doesn't
Mhm.
take a systems perspective to see how
Mhm.
that is just literally absurd. But another topic, another time, don't get too upset. But yeah, I think about how essential that is, particularly for the conversation around psychedelics, because psychedelics often like highlight the imbalances, right? Again,
Mhm. Mhm.
granted, we say that with nuance of knowing what it means to do them in different community spaces and how
Mhm.
and how we will interpret that experience. But generally, that heightened non-specific amplifier can make you feel
Mhm.
that incongruence in ways with systems and things that is pretty novel. And I think when I just find it so absurd how I can like walk down the streets and there's like alcohol advertisements here, left,
Mhm.
right, something that really like inhibits our reactions and slows us
Mhm.
down, right? To
Mhm.
not feel, to numb, right?
Mhm.
Versus something on the other side that really amplifies. Oh man,
Mhm.
I am really excited to see what that does do to us as a society as we feel more, as we have that. Again,
Mhm.
I know the nuance of it has to be within community and like that
Mhm.
important piece, but to just think about a world where alcohol has been so deeply normalized and to which is a drug, and to think about a
Mhm.
different drug like and these other drugs coming in to like at least equal caliber where you could walk
Mhm.
down the street and go be able to purchase that and have that experience. I am really interested to see how the world develops in that new
Mhm.
phase.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes, yes, yes. And yeah, it's so interesting to me how alcohol and also alcoholism is normalized in this
Yep.
country. um like there's this video trend on TikTok where people would do like before and afters, like, oh, the at the beginning of a party I look like this, and after some drinks I'm like sprawled out on the floor vomiting. And that people laugh at that, right? If it was any other class of drugs, people would be pathologizing those folks and saying like, wow, y'all got issues, and calling them all sorts of stigmatizing names. And so I think that some of the younger generations are starting to see how alcohol isn't really for them.
Yeah.
They're not interested in it. And not to say that, like, oh, psychedelics being more accessible is gonna make our world better, but it might, yeah, like you said, it's gonna be interesting to see how it plays out. What I think is important is harm reduction,
Right.
education. The war on drugs was a huge propaganda machine. And because of that, we are very miseducated about drugs, how they, work in our bodies and the effects of them. And so for me, it's really important to teach people, to give people an honest education about drugs without stigma, without shaming, because a lot of us are polysubstance users, right?
Yep.
A lot of times we're not just smoking weed. A lot of times we're drinking too, right? Or or we're not just drinking, maybe we're doing some cocaine or something, right?
Hmm.
So we have to step away from the purity values where we're acting all holier than thou because we've
Yep.
done psychedelics and we're
Yep.
all spiritual,
Yep.
and and really meet people where they are and think about what it means to increase access to a substance without educating people on that substance. um
Hmm.
I think it can be a recipe for disaster if we're not careful.
Yeah,
So yeah, I
absolutely.
think, yeah, the psychedelic world can stand to learn a lot from the harm reduction movement.
Absolutely. Harm reduction, pleasure enhancement, and that like
Mm-hmm.
need for both, right? And I think about Carl Hart's research with heroin, right? And letting go of
Mm-hmm.
psychedelic exceptionalism. That's another one that
Yep.
like people when I dropped that in the room, I had like a presentation of one of my classmates for training at school, not at Sauna Healing Collective, but actually in my
Mm-hmm.
school training. And the second I
Mm-hmm.
started talking about healthy heroin use, the room went silent. And I was like, ooh, this is fun, y'all. What are you feeling right now?
Yep. Yep. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
People are very uncomfortable with that. But it's funny because yeah, a lot of folks in the psychedelic space want to distance themselves from those kinds of users, right? But then it's like y'all will talk about, oh, plant medicine, plant medicine. Well, heroin comes from a plant too.
Yes.
Cocaine comes from a plant
Yes, it
too.
does.
When does something become plant medicine, and
Oh
when does it
man.
become a drug, right? And
Totally.
to me, yeah, psychedelic exceptionalism is also like respectability,
Yep.
making certain substances more respectable than others. And I don't think people realize that they're doing the war on drugs work for them by
Mhm.
kind of perpetuating this racialization and
Yes.
class associations of certain drugs, right? That's why certain drug users are more criminalized than others because they are associated with certain races or certain
Right.
economic classes of people.
Right. I think about crack versus cocaine, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cocaine, totally
Yeah.
cool, right? Like, or just the absurdity of like, if you're going to do psychedelic psychotherapy and you're getting ketamine injected, right? But a
Mm-hmm.
needle of a different kind. Ooh, not a needle. Oh no, right? And or if I'm snorting it, that feels
Mm-hmm.
so bad. It seems same substance. Same substance. But like the
Mm-hmm.
narratives around what it means to
Yep.
actually snort something versus have it injected and just the
Mm-hmm.
complexities of all the societal messaging around that and the ways that that's internalized for all of us in ways that if we are
Mm-hmm.
not actively looking at our shit, it is present.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's like just
Mm-hmm.
another system of oppression where we have to actively be examining where are these thoughts coming from? Who's telling me
Mm-hmm.
this, right? I mean, it is an endless well of digging up to get like all of that crap out of the water
Yes.
for some clear water at the
Mm-hmm.
bottom there. Jesus.
Yeah, that's so true. A lot of times I'm asked by people, well, how do I get involved? Like, what can I do? And something I always say is like, just educate yourself. Start
Yeah.
there because so many folks get excited with psychedelics. They want to immediately start being a practitioner, and it's like, no, it's so because we have so much shit that we've
Yeah.
internalized in propaganda. We need to educate ourselves and unpack all of our biases that we have against drug users, against people with addictions and other mental illnesses. Like that's a lot of work to unpack. And so that's why I am grateful that I came into reading Carl Hart's book when I
Right.
did, because he made it really simple. I thought it like on the cover, I was like, oh, he's a neuroscientist. There's gonna be some scientifical jargon.
Right.
And it wasn't. It wasn't. He really contextualized. He talked about his, growing up in Miami, but he was just like, yeah, if people have their needs met, then they're less likely to get addicted. Like, duh.
Right. I know.
um, so,
You say that, but man, in my substance use course, we had like a nice the person who was teaching it, Dr. Rachel Smith, love
mhm,
her. She taught it from a harm reduction perspective, and like one of the first questions she asked was like, how do you understand addiction, right? As a relational systems problem to like an internal diagnosis, sort
mm,
of disease model, right? And just
mhm,
watching my
mhm,
classmates spread up along that spectrum and knowing, damn, y'all are
mhm.
the future of clinicians out there. Like, holy shit, that message, we could spend a
Whew.
lifetime just trying to get people to understand literally systems, just systems.
Mhm,
Ugh, you
mhm,
know?
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man, that's so true. And when you were talking about that, that just made me think of how, like, yeah, I often say that we are integrating psychedelics into a burning house.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a great
and this is
saying.
yeah, this is a, MLK, he said that in regards to integration or desegregation. And I agree with psychedelics. Like, we're acting from this place of urgency. We're like, oh well, we need to fix mental health. It's like, yeah, that's true, but are we going to make it worse by speeding through it and not thinking really clearly about what could potentially happen here?
Mhm.
Or what if we redirected some of this sense of urgency towards legalizing or integrating psychedelics into other forms of activism and organizing, right?
Yeah.
What if we took all this energy towards psychedelics and said, hey, why don't we just decriminalize drug use, period, in this whole
Right.
country and free everybody who has been convicted of a drug offense? Like, how fast would things change if we redirected our energy there? I say that because there is kind of like this, I guess, internal argument in the drug policy reform world and the psychedelic world, where a lot of drug policy folks or harm reduction folks kind of see the attention that psychedelic organizers or organizations are having, and they're like, wait, where was this energy for
Oh,
all the other drug
right.
users? Or when are y'all going to acknowledge that the harm reduction movement that started gaining momentum through the HIV/AIDS crisis is the
Right.
reason that we're even able to talk about psychedelics in the way we are right now? Or
Mhm.
when are we going to acknowledge that other classes of drugs are fun too for people?
Right.
People find joy in that too. Like,
Hmm.
I've taken opioids for like pain before, but even with that pain, I'm like, damn, I see why people like this shit, because
Right.
it makes you feel like you're about to take the best nap of your life. And that's a great feeling, right?
Hmm.
so so I think we need more understanding and empathy towards each other. And I think we also need to look at how the systems we have in place are extremely carceral.
Yep.
Like, we don't have interventions for people who need help, really,
Nope.
especially at a young age. Like, I wrote a piece a few years ago for the American Association of Aging on aging incarcerated people, and I had the opportunity to interview a few older formerly incarcerated people,
Yeah.
and they shared their stories with me. And I was also doing research on this topic, and I just began to see how, if you were given a bad hand early on in life, the chances of you recovering from that are very small, and it's luck a lot of times, right? I remember reading like a woman's story who, I think, she lost her mom and she was sexually assaulted, and so
Mm.
that led to her committing a crime and going
Right.
and doing prison time because of it. And I just think of how so many people have had that same thing
Yep.
happen to them, where they had childhood trauma and they're essentially criminalized because of it.
Yes. Yes, and who needs to pay for that, right? We need a
Mhm.
different system that understands that perspective right there of trauma
Mhm.
and rehabilitation,
Mhm.
right? I mean, it's so
Mhm.
many conversations to have there. And I'm just so thankful for you coming into this space and sharing your narrative and sharing what you're passionate about and to hold this space with you of dreaming of another world so that we can, through the ripples of these conversations, kind of like bring the collective consciousness into more dreaming of what is possible
Mhm.
that will happen
Mhm.
beyond our lifetimes, right? And I'm conscious of our limited time together. And so I'm looking at the clock for you, and I know you have to dip out. I'm sure we could talk for hours about this. So, but I want to hold space if it feels good to you to bring you towards that closing question so I can get you out on time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate you just holding this space for me. And
Yeah.
I feel like I was all over the place in some ways,
It's
but
good. Every
that's
episode is.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that's the beauty of it, because psychedelics touches on so many things, and if anything, it teaches us that we're all connected in one way or the other.
Mhm.
So yeah, I'm I know I'm all over the place, but that's because that's the nature of
I
what we're
agree.
trying to do here.
I agree. And I think that that's where the powerful conversations are, talking about the larger ways that it's a part of this rather than just like the drug, right? It's all of the
Mhm.
rest of it that
Mhm.
really shapes the experience. So it was on
Mhm.
par for every modern anarchy conversation. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the closing question I ask every guest on the show is, what is one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal?
Mm. That's a great question.
Hmm.
One thing I would say is it is normal to keep your trauma a secret and be afraid to tell anyone. That is normal. But it's also normal to eventually, find your time to share with the people who you care about. So I say that because I just know there's people who are caring so much.
Yes. Hmm.
And it's okay. It's okay. But it's
Yeah.
also okay for you to be vulnerable.
Yeah, those tears coming up. I'd love to hear what's going on for you.
Oh, man. Well, I guess for me, I've been that person.
Yeah.
I've been that person. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't, I carried the my pain of
Mm,
my father being away for so long.
yeah.
I didn't feel like I could talk to anyone about it.
Mm,
And I guess what I would add on to that is that you have to give people a chance to show up for you. When you're carrying so much, it is scary, but we have to take a chance
mm,
sometimes and trust
yeah.
that people will show up for us in the way that
Mm-hmm.
we need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, I can feel the weight of that, of everything that you were carrying back then, right? Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. And to open up to people and tell them and really share that vulnerable piece of your story. Oh,
Yeah. 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 And it gets easier with time. It gets
mm-hmm.
easier with time. Yeah. And that's how we heal. That's how we heal, is by being held
Mm-hmm.
by our friends, our family, our community,
Yep.
all these experiences or traumas that we're ashamed of and that we're scared to really process. On the other side of that is healing and being
Yep.
held.
Yeah, it's that release to know that someone else knows. I don't know what you went through, but I'm hearing you, I'm seeing you, and I'm with you,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that
Mm-hmm.
ability to do that for the people that we love and care about in our community is what allows us to be seen and to release and be known, and that intimacy is life-changing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm thinking about what that looks like on an individual level, but also a collective level too.
Totally.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've talked to me individually today, but you've also talked to thousands of listeners, right, who are tuning in. And so I really appreciate the vulnerability to show up in this space, to trust me and to take that activism step of sharing
Hmm.
your vulnerability in such a public space. So I really, really appreciate
Yeah.
you.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for
Yeah.
being open to receiving. Yeah, I think vulnerability is how we is oftentimes the best side of ourselves that we keep away
Mhm.
from people, and there's nothing wrong with protecting your vulnerability, but I often think that's the most beautiful side of people.
Absolutely. I agree. I think it's the most transformative side. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I want to ask you too, for the people who have really connected with you and your work and your mission and your value systems and your dream and your vision, where can they find you to connect with you?
Yeah, so they can find us online. The People of Color Psychedelic Collective, our website is www.pocpc.org. I also have my personal website, www.ifetayo.me, and we can connect there.
Thank you so much for coming here. I really, really appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of
Yeah.
course. If you enjoyed today's episode, then leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. And head on over to modernanarchypodcast.com to get resources and learn more about all the things we talked about on today's episode. I want to thank you for tuning in, and I will see you all next week.